I keep coming back to intelligence as being a major
Yeah.
issue, interfactor, being able to identify the facts, and then by taking advantage of it, understanding what it is that you need to do to move into that role and to be effective. Family environment isn't particularly strong. It's other things, genetics, and the other factors are specific, individualistic experiences that each of these twins have that creates differences and similarities between them.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I'm excited to have Dr. Rich Arvey on the podcast to address the age-old question of, are leaders born or are they made? You'll want to stick around to the end of the episode to find out the answer and what it means for you. Dr. Arvey earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota. He has taught at numerous great universities, most recently serving as director of the Center for Strategic Leadership in the Business School at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Arvey has received multiple distinguished awards for his work. His scientific research has covered a wide array of topics, with the genetics of leadership being among them. In fact, he and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota were among the first to study the question of how genetics may influence leadership ability, and truly, they did groundbreaking work. Dr. Arvey, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Dr. Arvey, let's dive right into this idea of the genetics of leadership. You've done a lot of studies in the past in this field, as I mentioned, some groundbreaking work. And so I'm really interested, large scale, what did you find? What were the results of those studies that you did?
Well, bottom line is that, of course, it's both genetic and environmental influences. So there's a fairly simple, straightforward answer. The question might be more specifically, how much of these each will influence leadership, genetics or environment. And it's just ask whether it's one or the other is not the right question. It's how much, and are there other factors and interactions and qualifications that go into the equation here. I got into this stuff surprisingly a long time ago, if you want to know the kind of genesis of my work. When I was a student at the University of Minnesota in 1966, I took a class in behavioral genetics. The university required you to take a broad range of classes at the time. You couldn't just go in and start studying immediately your specialty area. So I took that class, and in the middle of the class, I said, why am I taking this class? I'm an organizational psychologist, But eventually, it wound its way through, and then 40 years later, I ended up starting to study that stuff in a much more rigorous fashion, and have enjoyed participating in this the last 10 to 15 years. My first area in genetics was actually looking at whether there's a genetic component to job satisfaction. And people have always seen, people used to say, it's the environment, it's your supervisor, it's your working conditions, it's your coworkers. All those are facets associated with whether you're satisfied at work or not. But then you get just observational, people that are either dissatisfied or satisfied with their job, no matter what the job. And so as a professor at that time, I was in business school. I had known and was collaborating with several of the folks in the psychology department, most notably Tom Bouchard and Matt McGeough. And they had done work on the genetics of intelligence as well as personality. And so they graciously accepted my idea. And we decided to study job satisfaction, and we found there 30% of the variation in job satisfaction among people has a genetic component. And that was kind of shocking because everybody thought it was environmentally determined, almost totally. And so that really kind of turned the field around a little bit. That was back in the 1980s. Of course, I was aware of the controversy and the question about is leadership something that people are born with, or do they have natural abilities and inclinations and so forth, or is it something that the environment produces? And nobody knew how to address it, except that the only way you could really study it is through genetic studies, using twin studies. So we engaged in 2 fairly sophisticated studies exploring this issue.
What is a twin study? How does that work? And how do
Sure.
we gather meaningful information from it?
There's basically 3 major research designs that you can use. One is with identical twins who were raised in different environments. And these are the study of twins reared apart. Identical twins share 100% of their genes in common, compared to fraternal twins that are half of their genes are in common, rather than 100%. Well, twins who are reared apart have 100% of their genes in common, but they have totally different environments. So if you located a group of twins that were separated at birth, locate them and measure them before they have any contact with each other, or much contact, you can estimate how much of something is genetic. So the researchers at Minnesota were looking at intelligence and showing that intelligence is quite highly genetically related, even to 30 to 40%. Physical attributes are much higher, as you may know, 70%, 80%. So we set off using that twin design initially for satisfaction, but the twins reared apart is a very rare sample, very rare.
Sure.
Especially now, because these are not anonymous adoption procedures and so forth. So the second major design is to use identical twins who are reared together, so they're 100% of their genes in common, but they have a common home environment. They went to the same school, they went to the same parents, they have all the kinds of things. They're born at the same time, the cohort differences are the same music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have fraternal twins born at the same time, same parents, but they only share half their genes in common. So if something is genetically induced or associated, generally speaking, the identical twins will have a greater similarity than the fraternal twins. And you can use fairly sophisticated statistical analyses to estimate how much of that variation is produced by genetics, and 2 other components. One is your home environment. They call it shared environment, common environment, and non-shared environment. Those are features that are associated with unique experiences that people have, right? I mean, you might, and this is not just in your background, when you're growing up, during your work histories, and so on and so forth. Those twin designs of twins reared together, fraternal twins, identical twins, we used in 2 different studies to look at leadership. The first one was with a male sample of twins. They have what they call a Minnesota Registry of Twins. We went and randomly selected a sample of about 200 identical twin pairs and a sample of 190 fraternal twins. So here you have the same common environment, but the variation is on the genetics, right? The 100% versus 50%. And so for the male for the male sample, we went in and just initially did the first look at, is there a genetic aspect to it? And lo and behold, it came out to be about 30% as well. Now, what that means is that there is about 30% of the variation between people is based on their genetic similarities, their genetic backgrounds. But the 70% is environmental. So based on that, you know that the environment carries the larger share of the freight in these particular designs. But we do know that the genetics have substantial role. And it becomes a little bit more obvious because when you think about the statistics, 30% is not a correlation. the correlation is actually around 70.70 for people, your listeners that have some knowledge about statistics. Well, that's pretty high. In fact, you can't find anything that is exogenously measured, something outside the twin themselves that correlates to that degree. So it's kind of strange. It's the smaller portion of variation, but it's still high correlationally, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing that was somewhat startling in this first study was that the common environment, the things that you shared with your twin as you were growing up, the same family, the same books in the household, same breakfasts, same school, so forth, didn't seem to matter. And people get kind of bothered by that. We did all this stuff in our family environment, didn't help at all. And, in fact, it's not as high as people think. We just can't find it. And that's true of a lot of other phenomena as well. Family environment isn't particularly strong. It's other things, genetics, and the other factors are specific individualistic experiences that each of these twins have.
It's striking to me that in your earlier studies, before you did the leadership analysis, when you're looking at job satisfaction, you found 30%. And now you find 30% with regard to leadership. And so I wonder if there's something about basically a third of our human experience in different domains that are this sort of domain, right? Because this is sort of social psychology, your area of training and expertise. If there's something about it that if we were to look at just about any domain, we would find that same kind of frequency.
Yeah. It's a very common signal. It's hard. First of all, it's hard to find something that isn't genetic. You can't find it. and then the studies generally range between 20 to 30% if it's psychological variables, and if it's like intellectual cognitive variables, then and then physical variables they're much more genetically determined.
Yeah.
But you're right. The range, that's the same kind of range, and you begin to scratch your head, say, what's going on here? Why is this always popping up for this value?
Yeah.
So the question became, does this replicable? So my second study, before I begin, the first study is basically silent in terms of one, what genes, right? And secondly, and even perhaps more profound, what experiences are producing this, right? And nobody knows the answer. No one knows it. They might have invested the experiences, but they're not controlling for genetics, and genetics not controlling for the environment. So we did another study, but this time using a female sample of twins. Same design, both sets of pairs, identical fraternal twins are both reared together, but there's variation on the genetic component to it. But on this study, we added a little bit of a wrinkle. That is, I started to ask, well, okay, if you did move into a leadership role, what are some of the kinds of things that might have helped you move into that role? And I gave them a series of items that they could check off and say, yes, this was important. Where they were, first of all, they're like parents, and they're friends and relatives. Did those produce something that helped you move into these roles? Secondly, is it your education? Was it experiences on the job? Was it your home life? Was it your religious context? And what was it, right? And we were able to look at the kinds of experiences and environmental components that were independent of genetics, because people were genetically involved whether they had these experiences, but we could parcel it out statistically. And we found that generally education and work experiences and things that happened to them on the job, including education, were the things that were most important developmentally for leadership. Whereas family and friends and personal kinds of setbacks and so forth didn't have the same kind of magnitude of relationship between them. So, if you're searching for ways to induce leadership, then you need to look carefully at the kinds of internal experiences that people are having in their jobs and careers. I'm sure you've probably heard this during the podcast. You ask people, well, what produced, how did you become a leader? I think it was, my mother did it. It was my mom, or my priest or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought, well, I mean, when you ask those kind of questions, people aren't expecting it, and the other girls are, I don't know. Let me think about that.
Right.
It's very come up with his answer, right? Got to at the
Yeah.
top of their legs. Anyway, so so we looked at this developmental kinds of things. By the way, for both of these studies, this is
Mhm.
important. We didn't study whether people were effective. We didn't explore anything other than that they move into positions of leadership. Were they occupying leadership roles? Which I think most people would argue is a first step in terms of this leadership journey, right? You got to be in the role. Not always. You have situations where you would emergent leadership, you take on leadership roles regardless of the context.
Right.
Most people would think of leadership roles as a formal designated role position in organizations. We left unexplored the issue of effectiveness, whether people are good leaders or bad leaders, whether people like them or not as leaders, all the kinds of variables that you probably already identified in this journey of looking at leadership. So then the second study was far more sophisticated, and I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't been really looked at as a major mover in the developmental literature for leadership. It seems to be fixated only on the genetic aspect of it. All right, so then going forward, my colleagues and I at the National University of Singapore went a little bit further, trying to find some specific genes that could be associated with the phenomenon. We've published a few things identifying a couple of the genes that are around, that are available in the database. Those are difficult databases to find, by the way.
Sure.
Genetic analysis and leadership with joint combination. We found a couple of them. They need to be replicated. There is some association with some of the genes, but I've always thought this needs to be replicated. You end up combing through this huge database, this huge number of genes, right? All these possible genes. And you find the one that's statistically associated with, but that always could be by chance. These are always kind of a rare phenomenon that you observe.
Sure. To touch on that a little bit, because I have expertise in cardiovascular genetics, and so just for our listeners, what you need to know is when people are doing genetic analyses, usually what they're looking for are changes in the lettering of the DNA to try to identify then changes in the protein that will be produced as a result of that DNA. And so they look at specific changes, like let's say one letter is changed from an A to a G. And if they find that people who are more commonly in leadership positions or show effectiveness in leadership or are faster runners or have blue eyes or whatever it may be, and they look at the 20,000 genes in the human body, and they find that among those with blue eyes, let's say, this letter T is changed to G in 80% of those with blue eyes, whereas in those with brown eyes, it remains a T. Then they could say, well, it sure seems like there's a signal coming from this specific gene that if you change that gene, then you will have blue eyes. And so it's the same when we talk about things like leadership. We analyze the genome that contains about 20,000 genes in the human genome and look for these changes that have spikes, differences that are consistent in the group that we're trying to study. So I just want to give that background context for our listeners.
Well, one of the things that you've indicated is pretty important is that there's a change. And a lot of these studies are not looking at changes. They're just looking at differences rather than in the configuration rather than the change. I also want to make it clear to your audience that I don't personally believe there's a gene that clicks on and off and you'll be a leader. I think this is all mediated through basically intelligence and personality and values and stuff like that, other kind of psychological mechanisms that this thing works its way through. And that needs to be identified too a lot more thoroughly. We've tried to do that, but it's not been very successful, actually, the mediation mechanism. Now, partly because our sample sizes are still fairly low. When I talk about 200 pairs, you got 400, twins, and that's pretty low sample when you're working on this kind of phenomena.
Yeah, and your ability, as you were mentioning earlier, to reproduce that in subsequent studies when you got a small sample can be difficult.
Yeah. There's also a publication bias that your better journals don't want to publish replications. They want to publish new stuff.
Right.
So you got the kind of thing working against you here. The other thing that maybe it's important to think is these are not studies of causality. These are basically association. This is correlated with this, is correlated with that.
Yeah.
So we don't have any causal change models at this point that's been working. One of my colleagues has been doing some work on that area, but that's one of the only change models that's been investigated here. It's been a wonderful ride in terms of my research career. I mean, whoever thought I'd be doing stuff on genetics back in 1966 after taking a class?
Sure. Yeah. It's funny the way careers flow and shape and end up places you never imagined. And
now, if I can interrupt you for a second.
Yes, sir.
It's also illuminating because that's how people move into leadership. They take advantage of the opportunities that are in the environment.
Yeah.
So it's not magical thing that you're going to automatically become a leader. It can be very determinative on the basis of availability of leadership positions, the kind of opportunities to get education, the kind of opportunities to get experience, the kind of mentoring you might have. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that. But if you are smart, and I think a large part of this is whether you're smart, is can you identify those things in the environment that seem to be operative? And that's what happened with me. I saw an opportunity to work with these folks in an unexplored area, and I went right ahead and did it. It's been very, very compelling.
Yeah, that actually, you're hitting on. I did a study in the paper, actually is currently under review. I'm hoping it is accepted soon, but where I was looking at success in among academic leaders at a large prestigious medical school, and was asking them about what does it take to be successful, and a number of them, 29 in fact of the 40 that we did these in-depth analysis interviews on analysis, 29 of them said, oh, it was luck. It just happened that, and they rattle off all these things. It just happened they went to Harvard. It just happened that they became, the chair of orthopedic surgery at a world-renowned institution. It just happened. I just fumbled into this, and that doesn't sit well with me because I think that's totally bogus. And so started analyzing what is serendipity, what is luck. And one of the things that you were just mentioning is the reason it reminded me. So there were I identified 3 P's, and then the fourth thing, which you were just talking about. First is position, being in the right position. Preparation is the first. You've prepared yourself. You've studied. You've worked hard. You've done these things to give you the opportunity to have a chance to do something. Second is then position. You're in the right place when this thing happens because of the preparation that you did. And then the third thing is promotion. Somebody, or what other people might call sponsoring or things of that nature, is somebody said, hey, here's a great opportunity for you. You should go after it. Or, hey, here is Rich Arvey. You want this guy on your team. So promotion. And then the fourth thing, which you are hitting on, is you seized it. You went out and you saw the opportunity and you grabbed it. And so I think this idea that you're just hitting on when it comes to leadership and most things in life is the ability to recognize an opportune moment and not having the doubt or the fear or whatever it is that keeps you from grabbing it.
I agree with that.
So anyway, that was something that just, as you were commenting, it just sparked this, wanted to share that with you. Yeah, I was just curious, thinking about this work that you've done and so forth. If you can think of, do you personally, in your own life or cases that you've seen where it was clear to you that, yeah, I think that I can see a distinct genetic component to this thing, or conversely, I don't see any way in the world that this is genetic.
You mean in terms of leadership?
Yes, sir.
Well, I've seen, I'm sure you have too, people who have gotten into positions of leadership that they have no business whatsoever being in that role. And how did they get there? Because of one thing or another. Maybe that is luck, but they were not prepared and they failed miserably, and the terrible style and alienated people and so on and so forth. So there's plenty of examples of that. And there's also examples on the other side of people who are brilliant and wonderful in their style and their ability to deal with other people and their management and their organization. And generally, I keep coming back to intelligence as being a major issue, a major factor, being able to identify the facts, and then by taking advantage of it, understanding what it is that you need to do to be to move into that role and to be effective. For example, I don't want to bring this back to myself, but I was department chair of the management department in U.S. And I got into it by chance because they just kicked the chair. It was vacated, so they needed somebody. They said, well, okay. And I had just gotten there. So they stuck me in the role, which is fine because I had been in academics for all my career. Mm-hmm. But once I was in the role, I looked at it and said, well, what's the role? What is the role requirements of this job? And, I had never thought about that before as just a faculty member. The role is to enhance the reputation of the department and the school by publications and by teaching. And there are different ways to affect each of those different, but it was sitting down and analyzing the role. And I know some people don't get it. As there are some people in political positions that don't seem to understand there's a particular role that they should be playing. Mm-hmm. But again, it comes back to try to understand what's the need to be effective in this role, and who are you serving, by the way, who are you serving?
Well, you've mentioned intelligence, and other folks have looked at this and found this idea that intelligence is on some level kind of one of the antes. You need to have it to get into the game, so to speak, to be considered a leader. It gets to this idea of competence that I've studied also in leadership. I don't know the literature on this, but maybe you have some feel for it. But to what degree, from genetic studies that have been done, do people say that intelligence is genetically mediated? Like, what percentage of intelligence comes from genetics?
Oh, it's very high. It's generally about 40 to 50% genetics. And that's just raw intelligence. So it's considerably genetically influenced. Mm-hmm. You can look at the spectrum of extremely ingenious level people, and you can go down to very, very minimally even flawed, defective intelligence. And you could say, in people at the low end, the lower third of the intelligence spectrum are not generally going to make it into leadership roles. It's when you get to the 50th percentile and above, not even 50th, it's probably 60th or 70th, get into the roles. I want to make one other comment here.
Sure.
On these studies, you have to be kind of careful because these genetic influences can bounce around a little bit depending on your sample.
Mm-hmm.
And just from a intuitive perspective, if you have an environment that's very broad, very enriched, right, that
Mm-hmm.
may probably play a greater role than genetics. On the other hand, if you have an environment where there is not a lot of opportunities and experiences, and so the environment is more constricted, then the genetics might be a more of a predominant factor. So it's not just one estimate fits all situations.
Mm-hmm.
And so we found the genetics estimate will jump around depending on what sample you use under what circumstances.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense as I'm listening to you. I was just thinking about athletes. And so this idea of having the opportunity, the exposure, the training, all
Yeah.
the different things that are needed. I was actually thinking of Usain Bolt. Perhaps Usain Bolt is actually the fastest person who has ever lived. That may actually be true for him.
Mhm.
But let's imagine that there's somebody out there somewhere who is really fast running around his village or whatever it may be, and he never had a professional coach, or or she never had weights to lift or a
Exactly.
track to run on or all these
Right.
sorts of things.
Right.
That person may actually be the fastest person who ever lived. It's just
Right.
that skill set, that capability set was not maximized in the way it was for Usain. Again, I pick him as because it it is hard to imagine somebody running faster than Usain Bolt. But for those of us who are typical, like normal humans, it is this environmental factor where we have had the opportunity, the development
Right.
to 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 grow in these ways.
Cul- to cultivate
Yeah,
uh,
cultivate, great word.
and, and leverage the basic skill level of individuals. It's pretty obvious in the sports arena. That's pretty clear. I
Yeah.
was laughing about a YouTube clip I saw the other day. Gary Oldman, who's a well-known actor,
Mhm.
he's on this clip. He says, "Look, I've gone through years and years and years of becoming an actor. Developing my craft. It's taken me all this time and cultivation of being a good actor." And then he says, I also noticed that professional basketball players spend years and years and years practicing, developing their skill sets. Says, what makes you think you can come in and be an actor? I don't try to come in your field and be a basketball player.
Right. Right.
It
Yeah.
was funny.
Yeah, it's this idea that's out there of 10,000 hours to mastery,
Yeah.
plus or minus depending on the domain. But anyway, yeah, that it that you can have a lot of raw talent, but if you don't actually focus it and
Yeah.
cultivate it, as you said,
Exactly.
you're not going to be what you could be. And I think that's absolutely the case for leadership.
I don't remember the guy's name, but he was a guy living in India who was in this village, and he became he was a mathematical genius that he just kind of arose, and he happened to find some book on math and geometry and read
Mhm.
it and wrote away and became a very well known uh, mathematical scholar. That's interesting. He had nothing in that environment other than the book he found. He found a
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's amazing what some folks can do with just a book. Well, I was wanting to kind of touch for our listeners. I was wanting to just kind of run through some of the scientific stuff here for them, and then I've got a couple other curiosities that I want to throw at you. But when we look at the scientific studies that have been done to answer this question, are leaders born or are they nurtured and cultivated? perhaps the first study was from Andrew Johnson's 1998 twin study. And
Yeah.
there they used this questionnaire, and they found that this idea of transformational leadership was significantly related to genetic components. In fact, in that study, they suggested it was as much as 60%.
Yeah.
And then in 2004, the same group further analyzed data from that same group of twins and found a significant positive genetic correlation with 3 of the big 5, what are called the big 5 personality traits. And so openness to experience, conscientiousness, and extroversion. And those have been also shown in other domains to be associated with greater leadership capability. More recently, a couple of groups, and you've been involved with these, have done more in-depth genetic analyses and actually looking at these genes and trying to identify those underlying drivers. In their 2013 study, the team of Jan Emmanuel Deneve found that changes in a specific gene, RS4950, were associated, again, as you said, with leadership role occupancy, not necessarily effectiveness. And then similarly, in 2015, another group led by Wen-Dong Lee at Kansas State found a relationship between a dopamine transporter gene, that's DAT1, and leadership role occupancy. So I think that, there are data clearly that show that there's some genetic contribution to this. I think it's important, just as you hit on earlier, that these really are looking at people in leadership positions, which is, as we've said here and on previous episodes of the Science of Leadership, isn't exactly synonymous with actual leadership.
The other thing that the earlier studies often will use self-reports of transformational leadership, and I prefer a more objective measure.
Yeah.
And this study after study showing that people answer these questions the same way. Male might agree more often or disagree more often, depending on how close you are with your twin. And so it's important to get an objective measures. And mine is not perfect, by the way. I just asked them, were you in positions of leadership and at what level? And I went back and tried to verify that, and kind of got myself a little bit into trouble as a scholar, because I reached back into my sample and would call them on the phone. Were you really in this leadership position? And they got all offended because they were thinking I didn't believe them.
Yeah, just trying to verify the data. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that about transformational leadership. I did this study a few years ago now and it was in physicians, and where I looked at their self-assessment of their leadership capabilities and readiness versus their actual knowledge of leadership and so forth. So really kind of this idea that Dunning and Kruger looked at with regards to assessment of one's capabilities versus actual capability on a test and so forth. And it turned out that the majority of people, well, the average was 60%. They all thought they were at least the 60th centile with regard to capabilities relative to their peers. And that was among those who were at the very bottom, who did the poorest. They actually thought they were at least as good as those who were the very best. And so I can understand how,
very poor assessments, right?
Very poor. There's some question as to the validity and veracity of data when it's self-assessment.
In my previous work, I used to do quite a bit of consulting when I was at the University of Minnesota. And I found myself doing work for hospitals in some cases, but also other organizations, of being asked to come in and look at the leadership style of these individuals that were kind of failing in their jobs, and they seem not to understand that they're in trouble. And I would come in and I would interview their subordinates and so forth, and give them massive feedback. They were shocked that they were that they were viewed in this way.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be pretty damn important to give them credible, massive, blunt feedback
Yeah.
about their style.
Yeah.
Some of were in the major internationally known hospitals.
Yeah. As we think about this, the question for our listeners, I would think, is what do we make of this research? Are leaders born or are they made? I mean, you kind of hit on this earlier, but just to summarize, what would you say?
Well, I'd say, again, it's both. That the genetics is significant, not trivial.
Mm-hmm.
You can't take somebody that is not at all capable of being a leader and make them into a leader. But you can capitalize on individuals who have those talents. But the lion's share is the environment and how you can developmentally nudge them into to move into those roles and be effective. Genetics is important and it's not trivial, but it's
Mm-hmm.
probably as high a correlation you'll find with any other exogenous factor, any other independent factor that you could find. So it's a pretty fascinating journey.
Yeah.
Here. We're kind of at a point where I won't do any more studies. I'm retired,
Yeah.
but kind of to do this again and again and again doesn't make any sense for me or a lot of other people too.
Right. This idea of, to some degree, what we would refer to as epigenetics. So for listeners, our DNA isn't necessarily just our DNA. We can get exposed to certain things that will trigger our genes to produce more products, more protein, and can change how we manifest. And so that there are definitely environmental factors that impact our genetic makeup to affect how we present. And that could be a host of things we don't understand very much at all, honestly.
Right.
Whether it's the amount of water we drink, the amount of sunlight we experience, even perhaps some sort of developmental opportunities with regards to training and learning. There's just that is, I think I've been saying for a decade or better, the more we learn about genetics, the less we know. So
it's a nice way of putting it. Well, I think it demands, if you want to get into the field, you have to have a knowledge base about leadership. You have to know something about genetics, and you have to know something about the very sophisticated statistical methods that you would use to analyze that. That's those three elements, three knowledge components are pretty darn hard to find. It's helpful to do this in a team approach where people have different skill sets from a research basis.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, because it's hard to find all that in one stop.
Right.
Certainly. Well, as I've thought about this idea of nature versus nurture with regard to leadership, whether they're born or they're made, I think having spent a lot of time studying populations with genetic conditions and all the work that I've done in studying leadership, I've given a lot of thought to this question. And just like you, it's clear to me that there are people who are born with certain attributes that increase their ability to influence other people. Those may be things like, are they tall? Are they attractive? Are they intelligent? Just like you said. Do they have a magnetic personality? All those things have been associated with being more likely to be a leader, but that's only a portion of it. And so the majority of it, I think, it is made. So I'm in agreement with the United States Marine Corps. Leaders are made for the most part.
That's interesting.
That said, just from the standpoint of the intellectual component, I've mentioned my son a few times on this podcast before, but something I've told him, intellectually, he's exceptional, and you understand what I mean when I say the word exceptional. He's exceptional, and quantitatively, diagnostically. But what I've always told him is IQ doesn't mean anything. It's what you do with it that counts. So that's the first thing. The second thing goes along with it, and this will seem like it's coming out of left field, but have you ever seen the movie Gattaca with Ethan Hawke and Jude Law?
I've never seen it.
Okay.
I wish I had.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend it to you just from the standpoint of thinking about this concept of genetics and to what degree that plays a role. But that movie, for me, that movie brilliantly demonstrates this idea that it's not what you're born with that matters, it's what you do with it that counts. So Jude Law, and this is a futuristic movie where a certain percentage of the population has been genetically manipulated to be genetically perfect. And they're called valids, I think. And those people that are like the rest of us who have plenty of imperfections, I think are called invalids. And so Jude Law's character in this, he's this perfect laboratory engineered genetic composition, but he squandered it. He blew it, and he ended up doing stupid things. He ended up paralyzed and some other things. And so he didn't capitalize on his genetic perfection. Ethan Hawke's character, his name is Vincent, is one of these invalids. So he's non-engineered. And yet, because of his desire, extreme desire to pursue his dream of going to space, he's able to overcome his genetic profile. And so it really is a good movie. But I take away from that movie that a person can have the greatest set of talents and gifts imaginable, but if they don't invest in using those and developing those, cultivating, as you said, it won't matter. Whereas another person could start out without the genetic predisposition, the genetic strengths, if you will, but through dedication, application, perseverance, grit, could build their capabilities to achieve something great. And that's the thing I tell my son over and over again. It doesn't matter what you're born with, it's what you do with it. And I think that's the reality for just about any human endeavor, especially for leaders.
Right. I think you're right on, spot right on. And how does he react to that?
He's growing. I mean, he's almost 17 now, and I think that he sees some of my didactics, if we'll use that word, the things I'm trying to teach him through probably longer lectures than he desires, as being valuable. And I'm hoping that he'll see them as more so a little bit down the road.
According to my research, what you're saying doesn't make any difference at all.
Well, I'm still going to invest in it, I guess.
Sorry. I'm joking a little bit, of course.
Sure. Well, as I say, I believe it's both. I think anybody can be a better leader. I think if we were to look at those who are the best in history, they're likely to be ones who started off with some innate advantages. But the reality is, those of us, you and I, and those people that are listening, we don't really know which bucket we're in, genetically speaking. So we all just got to do our best to apply ourselves.
Humble your way through it. Yeah.
Yeah, to be better than what we are.
Right.
And then I think ultimately it won't matter what the genetics say.
Well, I remember I had this thought the other day for some strange reason. I was a football player in high school and went on to college and was thinking about playing football. And I decided I'm not going to do that because it's just too small to play college football. And I took myself out of the field with that. But it would be useful. And then all of us have particular strengths and weaknesses, certain kinds of things we're really good at, things we're not good at. And it would be useful to have kind of some talent diagnostic work early even in high school. I mean, are you good with your hands? Do you have good reaction for your hands? Are you have good eyesight? Or what are some limitations that you can do or not do? And start to weed out things instead of telling everybody you can be whatever you want to be, which I think is just not a good advice.
Sure. Yeah.
Find out where your strengths are and start to tap into those and find ones that work for you. And that's including
Right.
leadership. If that's what you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Figure out where you can do the best with what you've got and apply yourself to the best of your capabilities. And that's leadership. I think more power to you. So,
Yep. I hope this is helpful to your listeners.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I hope so too. It's certainly been great for me. It's been a delight to have you on the Science of Leadership here and to, I think, come to a pretty good answer on this age-old question: are leaders born or are they made? The answer is yes.
Well,
so thank you
one
for
thing
being
you
with
know
us.
for sure, leaders are born.
Yeah, we're all born. At some point, we all have to be born. That's absolutely correct. Well, thanks for being on the Science of Leadership with us, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.